The 1940s had been a hard decade for most sports. The Second World War had left the global economy in ruins, and popular recreations of all kinds had become increasingly rare. Jiu-Jitsu was badly affected by this. Helio Gracie had not fought since 1937, Oswaldo Gracie had died in 1943, and the Brazilian competition scene was now effectively silent. One sport that did manage to flourish in the immediate post-war years was boxing, with famous matches like Sugar Ray Robinson versus Jake LaMotta in 1945 and Willie Pep versus Sandy Sadler in 1949. In 1950, the boxing craze came to Brazil, and America's premier heavyweight fighter, Joe Louis, travelled to Rio to compete in a series of exhibition matches.
Joe Louis, the man who was to earn the title of Brown Bomber and retire undefeated.
Louis was a big deal, a former world champion with a record 25 title defences and one of the great African-American sporting heroes, whose fights could reliably attract massive crowds. The Gracie family saw an opportunity to get in on this action, and Helio began issuing challenges to the travelling boxer, proposing a no-time limit vale tudo match, where both strikes and grappling would be freely permitted. Helio pointed to an impressive list of boxers and strongmen that he had already defeated. A match with Louis, he declared, would end in just the same way. Unsurprisingly, Joe Louis refused Helio's offer. He explained that he was a professional boxer with bigger fish to fry. Although his attempt to fight the best boxer in the world had failed, Helio's passion for the golden era of jiu-jitsu challenge matches in the 1930s seemed to have been revived. Only 2 months later, he found a suitable opponent, Landulfo Caribe, otherwise known as the Human Thunderbolt, who he defeated in less than 4 minutes with a choke. A few weeks later, Helio fought another match against a jiu-jitsu expert named Azevedo Maya. Once again, Helio defeated his opponent, this time in only 2 minutes. That same year, a German diplomat and jiu-jitsu enthusiast visited Rio. He trained with Helio, afterwards declaring, amid great controversy, that "I can affirm that I have never known a fighter as astonishing as Helio, with such prodigious knowledge. Not even the famous Baron Jigoro Kano. Helio is incomparably better than Kano." Whether this was hyperbole or not, it seemed that after more than a decade of inactivity, Helio was back, and determined to fight any opponent that confronted him. The more skilled, the better. It wouldn't be long before Helio's wish came true. In 1951, 3 Japanese judo fighters arrived on the shores of Brazil, planning to participate in a series of lucrative exhibition matches. The trio included a man named Masahiko Kimura, who was widely regarded to be the best judoka that Japan had ever produced. He had risen prodigiously through the Kodokan as a teenager, before becoming the All-Japan Judo champion, aged 20. He was now 34 years old and had developed an almost mythical reputation. It was said that he trained more than 5 hours every day, and that his osotogari, or outer leg reap, was so strong that it could break a blossom tree. The Brazilian press were thrilled by these recent arrivals. Not since the days of Mitsuya Maeda had such authentic and highly acclaimed judokas set foot in Brazil. Onoche explained that Kimura had not lost in 15 years, and that, standing 170 centimetres tall and weighing over 90 kilos, he was a human brick with the efficiency of dynamite. With his recent dominance in jiu-jitsu competition, Helio Gracie was the obvious match for Kimura. However, before this could happen, he would have to face one of Kimura's companions, a Kodokan black belt named Yukio Kato. Kimura later recalled that Kato, who was the youngest of the Japanese visitors, had volunteered himself to fight Helio first, perhaps as a form of gatekeeping, in order to make sure that Kimura would only face the best opponents. The decision also made sense from a marketing standpoint. If Helio was able to defeat Kato, it would be the perfect setup for a nationalistic revenge match between the Brazilian and Japanese champions. Whatever the actual reasons were, the fight between Helio and Kato was scheduled for September 1951 at the Maracanã Stadium in Rio. From the outset, the match followed the traditional dynamics of a Japanese throwing expert versus a Brazilian ground fighter. Kato was able to throw Helio regularly, who in return dragged Kato down to the mat. From here, Helio was positionally dominant, although unable to attack effectively. The fight was declared a draw, a verdict that the local press subsequently agreed was fair. Although the result had not been particularly exciting, The match was a major financial success and one of the highest grossing martial arts events that Brazil had ever seen. It was not long before a rematch had been organised, this time in Sao Paulo. The second fight proved to be more exciting than the first. Kato came out aggressively, at one point nearly throwing Hélio out of the ring altogether. Shortly afterwards, he tripped Hélio before going to ground with the Brazilian fighter. This would prove to be his fatal mistake. From here, Hélio was able to establish his famous guard and lock in a collar choke, rendering Kato unconscious. The home crowd exploded in celebration. Even against the finest judokas in the world, the Brazilians could not be beaten. Many years later, Kimura reflected on the match. He felt that Kato had exhausted himself trying to throw his opponent and made a fundamental strategic error. He remembered shouting from his corner in the ring, "Kato, what are you doing?" With the defeat of his younger companion, Kimura gladly accepted a match against the victorious Brazilian, which was set for October the 13th in the basketball court back at Maracanã in Rio. The upcoming fight was a significant threat to Hélio's unbeaten record. Throughout his extensive experience in the ring, the youngest of the Gracie brothers had demonstrated an uncanny ability to survive against skilled fighters, especially Japanese judokas. He had also proven himself against much larger, physically imposing opponents. However, he had never faced such a dangerous combination of the two. Kimura was a large man, outweighing the Brazilian by more than 20 kilos, who was famed for his unnatural strength. He was also believed to be one of the most technically proficient judokas that the world had ever seen. This would undoubtedly be Hélio Gracie's biggest challenge yet. The rules remained unchanged from the Kato matches. A competitor could win by submission or knockout, no striking was allowed, and both men would wear kimonos. After a long argument about referees, the contest started shortly before midnight, in front of a large and impatient Brazilian crowd. Kimura dominated the match right from the beginning, throwing his opponent with a series of his favourite techniques, Ippon Seoinage, Uchimata, Haragoshi, and of course his famous Osotogari. One onlooker would describe how Hélio was a dummy in the powerful hands of Kimura. Going into the second round, Kimura seemed determined to finish the fight, throwing Hélio to the ground. From here, he locked on to the Brazilian's arm with a double wrist lock, known in judo as an udigarami. Kimura would later describe that when he began applying the technique, he expected that his opponent would tap immediately. With the characteristic defiance of a Gracie, Hélio refused to capitulate, allowing his shoulder to break. Kimura kept rotating his opponent's arm before Carlos Gracie, realizing that the situation was hopeless, threw in the towel. Kimura had won, and in a fashion that was dominant and unambiguous. This was a significant victory for Kimura, who had successfully rehabilitated the reputation of Japanese judo, and from this point onwards, the double wrist lock that had been used to finish the fight would be commonly referred to in the Western world as a Kimura. Despite having been officially defeated for the first time, the match was also something of a moral victory for Hélio Gracie, who had demonstrated a willingness to fight even the most dangerous opponents, as well as an indomitable will in the face of physical harm. Both fighters were therefore propelled into international fame. The match was also a symbolic benchmark in the history of judo and jiu-jitsu. Back in the 1930s, the two arts had remained relatively intertwined, sharing overlapping terminology, traditions, and a place within the Brazilian competition scene. Kimura versus Gracie marked a distinct point of separation. The styles had become clearly detached in the eyes of the contemporary media. With this, the concept of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as opposed to Japanese Judo, had been permanently established within the public consciousness. Hélio Gracie retired after the Kimura fight. This left the heavy burden of Brazil's Jiu-Jitsu ascendancy on the shoulders of other representatives, many of whom were part of the new generation of Jiu-Jitsu fighters, young men training at any of Brazil's numerous academies, such as Carlos and Hélio's school in Rio de Janeiro, George Gracie's academy in Recife, or Takeo Yano's in Pernambuco. Another notable producer of Jiu-Jitsu talent in this period was Oswaldo Fada. Fada had opened an academy in the northern part of Rio in 1951. His proximity to the main Gracie Academy ignited a territorial rivalry between the two schools. This situation was exacerbated by Fada's lineage. He had been taught jiu-jitsu by a man called Luiz Franca. Franca claimed he had learned directly from Mitsuyo Maeda, the legendary progenitor of jiu-jitsu in Brazil. This meant that Fada was a rare figure, a Brazilian instructor teaching Jiu-Jitsu who was not affiliated in any way with the Gracie family. The tensions between the two academies came to a head in 1952, with Fada writing in the local newspaper that, "We wish to challenge the Gracies. We respect them like the formidable adversaries they are, but we do not fear them. We have 20 pupils ready for the dispute." Elio accepted his challenge, and the feuding parties agreed to hold a tournament at the Gracie Academy. Although the results were mixed, it was generally agreed that Fada students had come out on top overall. This was largely due to their proficiency in using straight footlocks, which Carlos derided afterwards as a suburban technique. The Fada incident posed a clear threat to the Gracie monopoly of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In order to effectively defend their reputation, the family would need new representatives, armed with the physical advantages of youth and the ruthless determination of Gracie blood. Luckily, they had the perfect candidates, Carlos's two eldest sons, Carlson and Hobson. Unlike their father and their uncles, who had discovered martial arts in early adulthood, the young brothers had been training jiu-jitsu for their entire lives, with the constant expectation that they would enter into the family trade. In 1953, aged 19, Carlson did just this, fighting against an 100-kilo capoeira representative named Quirandinha. The rules were vale tudo, there was no time limit, strikes and grappling were permitted, and matches could only end by knockout or submission. The fight was chaotic. After a flurry of punches and kicks from both fighters, they ended up on the ground, where Carlson quickly took Quirandinha's back and applied a rear naked choke to win. Carlson versus Quirandinha was one of many vale tudo matches that started to burst onto the Brazilian competition scene, with popular and well-organised fights taking place on a regular basis. Carlson and Hobson would go on to participate in many of these and developed a reputation for aggressiveness in the ring, a style that differed from Elio's more defensive brand of jiu-jitsu. By 1954, the face of jiu-jitsu had changed significantly from the pre-war period. There are three main areas we might focus on to demonstrate this. Firstly, jiu-jitsu was now relatively famous, with televised matches and sustained media coverage spreading the word to new parts of Brazilian society and beyond. Despite his defeat to Kimura, Elio Gracie was the main recipient of this new popularity, having been elevated to something of a national sporting hero. Secondly, the period had seen the emergence of vale tudo fighting as a legitimate and popular sport. This offered a high-profile venue for jiu-jitsu experts to demonstrate their skills outside of the more limited grappling rule sets. This would become an increasingly significant part of the Gracie family's identity over the next decades. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, jiu-jitsu was now regarded as a distinctly Brazilian sport, practiced by Brazilians, watched by Brazilians, and mediated by the cultural values of Brazil. The Gracies were, of course, considered to be the main representatives of this new Brazilian art. This brought them fame, money, and success. However, in the future, it would also attract a series of dangerous challengers who would seek to dethrone the self-proclaimed champions of Brazil over the coming years.